The morning they let me go, the office smelled like burnt coffee and someone's microwaved salmon from the floor above. I remember that clearly. Not the words Dorian used, not the precise choreography of his hands as he gestured at the chair across from his desk, the one reserved for vendors and people being managed out. I remember the smell, rancid and incongruous, cutting through the recycled air of the 32nd floor of Aldercroft Capital's headquarters on a Tuesday in March. I had been the chief financial officer of that company for 6 years. 6 years of quarterly earnings calls where I sat 2 seats to the left of the CEO and never once spoke above a calm register. 6 years of audits I prepared so thoroughly that our external reviewers once told me, privately, that examining our books was the least eventful part of their entire portfolio. 6 years of watching the company grow from a mid-sized asset management firm with a regional reputation into something that sat comfortably in the top tier of institutional investors on the eastern seaboard. I built the financial architecture that made that growth possible. I want to say that without drama because it wasn't dramatic. It was work. Meticulous, painstaking, deeply unglamorous work. The kind that happens at 6 in the morning when no one else is in the building yet. When you're the only person in a glass-walled office reviewing a derivatives exposure report for the 3rd time because something in the numbers felt slightly off. And it turned out, yes, something was slightly off. And catching it saved the firm approximately $4 million in potential liability. That was a Tuesday in November, 3 years ago. Dorian sent me an email afterward. The subject line said, "Nice catch." 2 words. I saved that email. Not out of sentimentality, out of habit. I saved everything. The Tuesday in March when he fired me, he sat behind his desk and folded his hands and looked at me the way he looked at a budget line he had already decided to cut. "We're restructuring the executive leadership team," he said. The words landed with that particular quality that corporate language develops when someone has rehearsed them too many times. Smooth, slightly hollow. I didn't say anything. "It's not a reflection of your performance," he said, and I watched his eyes move briefly to the window and back. That flicker. I'd seen it before, in people who weren't quite lying and weren't quite telling the truth. "The board has identified some areas where we feel the company needs to evolve." I was 51 years old. I had a degree in applied mathematics from a university that had rejected Dorian's application 25 years before he hired me. I had a CPA, a CFA, and 15 years of financial leadership experience before I ever walked through Aldercroft's doors. I also had, at that particular moment, a folder of information sitting on a secure encrypted drive at home that I had been quietly building for 7 months. I did not reach for anger. Anger would have been a waste of the next 6 minutes. "Am I being terminated for cause?" I asked. "No," he said too quickly. "Then I'll need the full severance package as outlined in my contract. 18 months of salary, continuation of benefits, and the vesting of my outstanding equity grants per Section 12 of my employment agreement." He blinked. He had expected tears, or questions, or bargaining. He had not expected Section 12. "HR will be in touch to..." "I'll also need written confirmation today before I leave the building that the termination is without cause. I want it on company letterhead and I want it signed by you and a member of the board." The salmon smell had faded. I could hear the building's ventilation system. A low, constant hum. The kind that's easy to stop noticing until you're in a room where nothing else is happening. "That's not typically how we..." "Dorian?" I said his name the way I said numbers when I needed someone to stop talking. Flat. Precise. "I've spent 6 years ensuring this company's financial disclosures are accurate and compliant with every applicable regulation. I know what's in my contract, because I negotiated every clause of it myself. I am asking you for documentation of a termination without cause so that my severance can be processed cleanly and you can proceed with your restructuring. That is a simple administrative request." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Of course, I'll have legal draft something." I nodded. I stood. I did not shake his hand. At the elevator, I pressed the down button and stood there for 11 seconds before it arrived. I counted them, not because I was composing myself, or because I needed to breathe, or because I was holding back anything. I was thinking. I was already running calculations. I had been CFO of Aldercroft Capital for 6 years. In that time, I had seen the company from the inside, the way a surgeon sees a body. Not the surface, but the systems, the veins, the places where things were connected in ways that weren't obvious until you'd spent long enough looking. And for 7 of those 72 months, I had been looking at something specific. It started with a footnote. That sounds unimpressive, but footnotes are where the real information lives in financial documents. The body of a quarterly report is the story a company tells about itself. The footnotes are the story it's legally obligated to tell, and there is frequently a gap between the two. In July of the previous year, I was reviewing the Q2 disclosures before they went to our external auditors. Standard procedure. I had done it 23 times before. I got to footnote 14, which concerned our exposure to a set of structured credit instruments we had originated in partnership with a boutique advisory firm called Meridian Capital Partners. The numbers were correct, but the dates were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that screams fraud, the kind of wrong that you dismiss the first time because you assume it was a clerical error. 2 dates in the amortization schedule were off by 11 days, and the effect of that 11-day shift was to defer the recognition of approximately $3 million in unrealized losses to the following quarter. I marked it for correction. The next day, the footnote came back from legal review unchanged. I sent a query. The response came from a paralegal whose name I didn't recognize, and it said that the dates reflected the contractual settlement terms and required no adjustment. I pulled the underlying contracts. The underlying contract said something different from what the paralegal said. I didn't raise it again. Not yet. I made a copy of the original footnote, a copy of the legal response, a copy of the contracts, and I put them in an encrypted folder on a personal hard drive that I kept at home. Then I went looking for other footnotes. I found 11 more over the following 6 months, each one small, each one defensible in isolation, each one contributing in aggregate to a pattern that was not defensible at all. Someone was manipulating Aldercroft's financial disclosures in a coordinated, systematic way. The total exposure I had identified, conservatively, was somewhere between $20 and $40 million in deferred or misrepresented losses, spread across 6 consecutive quarters, sophisticated enough to avoid triggering the automated flags in our audit software, crude enough that a human being who was paying attention could see it. I had been paying attention. The question was, who else was? When you discover something like this inside a company you work for, you have several options, and none of them are comfortable. You can report it internally, but internal reporting only works if the people above you are not involved. If the manipulation is originating from or protected by executive leadership, then reporting internally is less a whistleblowing mechanism and more a notification to the people concealing the problem that you found it. You can report it externally immediately. The SEC has a whistleblower program with meaningful financial protections and potential awards. But premature reporting, before you have documented the full scope and can demonstrate the pattern clearly, risks having the investigation stall or the evidence being obscured. You can do nothing. Let it continue. Protect yourself by not knowing. I had never found that option convincing. What I did, for 7 months, was document. Every discrepancy, every date anomaly, every footnote that didn't match the underlying contracts. I cross-referenced our disclosed figures against public filings from Meridian Capital Partners, which, as a registered investment advisor, had its own disclosure obligations. And I found that the divergences in our numbers corresponded precisely to places where Meridian's numbers had been, adjusted in a complementary direction. This was not a clerical error. This was a coordinated effort between 2 entities to shift losses between periods in a way that neither firm's investors would see them coming. I built a chronology, I built a causation map, I documented the chain of custody for every piece of evidence. I kept 3 encrypted copies on different devices, one of which lived in a safety deposit box at a bank I used for personal accounts only, one that had no connection whatsoever to Aldercroft systems. And then I came into work on a Tuesday in March, and the salmon smelled terrible, and Dorian folded his hands and told me the company was restructuring. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The woman they hired to replace me was named Delphine Voss. I learned this from a press release issued 11 days after my termination, which I read on my laptop from my kitchen table while drinking coffee that I had made myself, had a temperature and strength I had always preferred, and had never had time to actually enjoy during the working week. The announcement called her a transformative financial leader with a decade of experience across private equity and asset management. It listed an impressive array of credentials and previous roles. It included a photograph in which she looked approximately 34 years old, which was, I later confirmed, accurate. Dorian was quoted as saying the hire reflected Aldercroft's commitment to innovative leadership. I read the press release twice. Then I opened a different file. I had done what any thorough person would do. In the weeks between my termination and the announcement of Delphine's hire, I had begun quietly reconstructing the timeline of how my departure had been arranged, because whoever was behind the financial manipulation I had found would have needed to remove me. I was the CFO. I was the person most likely to find what I had found, and eventually to act on it. Someone had concluded that I was a risk. The question was whether Delphine Voss was a new risk or an existing asset. The press release said she was coming from a firm called Wyndham Strategic Advisors. I looked up Wyndham Strategic Advisors. It was a small private equity advisory firm with offices in 2 cities and a client list that was not publicly disclosed. Standard enough. Then I looked at the partners. Wyndham's founding partner was a man named Gideon Holt. Gideon Holt had, I discovered after 40 minutes of cross-referencing, served on the advisory board of Meridian Capital Partners until 14 months ago. I made myself another cup of coffee. Then I went back to my encrypted folders and started building a second chronology. This one tracked not the financial discrepancies, but the personnel and relationship connections. Wyndham to Meridian. Meridian to Aldercroft. Delphine to Wyndham. Dorian to the Aldercroft board members, who had approved her hire. It took me 4 days to build it cleanly. When I was done, I had a document that told a coherent story. Not a perfect story, not a provable story, not yet, but coherent enough that the right investigator with the right tools and subpoena authority could take what I had and use it as a roadmap. I knew about the SEC's whistleblower program in the general way that financial professionals know about it. I became expert in it in approximately 3 days. The relevant statute was Section 21F of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, as amended by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010. Under that statute, individuals who voluntarily provide original information about securities law violations to the SEC, where that information leads to a successful enforcement action resulting in sanctions exceeding $1 million, are eligible for awards of between 10 and 30% of the sanctions collected. More importantly, the statute prohibits retaliation against whistleblowers by their employers, and it provides for confidentiality. The SEC is prohibited from disclosing information that could identify a whistleblower without consent. My former employer had already terminated me. The retaliation protection had a different relevance in my situation. What mattered was the confidentiality and the process. I retained an attorney who specialized in securities whistleblower claims. Her name was Elena Carr, and she came recommended by a former colleague who described her as someone who had made several large financial institutions significantly less comfortable with their current practices. I liked that description. Elena reviewed my documentation over 2 meetings in her office, which smelled like paper and strong tea, and she didn't say much during the first meeting except to ask clarifying questions. During the second meeting, she sat back in her chair after 40 minutes and said, "This is a well-constructed submission." "It's not complete," I said. "No, but the pattern you've identified is documentable from public records in a way that is genuinely useful. The internal materials you've preserved are going to be the core of this. Have you had any contact with anyone at the company since your departure?" "None. My employment counsel handled the severance documentation." "Good. Keep it that way." She tapped her pen on the table. "The challenge in cases like this is timeline. The SEC has resources, but their enforcement division is stretched. Getting to the front of the queue is partly about the quality of the submission and partly about demonstrating that the harm is ongoing and material." "The harm is ongoing," I said. "Delphine Voss starts on Monday." Elena looked at me. "How certain are you that she's involved?" "I'm certain that she came from a firm connected to the entity that Aldercroft was coordinating with on the disclosures. I'm not certain of her personal knowledge, but whoever brought her in to replace me did so, knowing that the manipulation was ongoing. She'll have access to the same systems I had. She'll either continue what was happening, stop it, or discover it and report it herself. The third option would complicate things for your submission. Yes, which is why the timeline matters. Elena filed the whistleblower submission through the SEC's online tips, complaints, and referral system on a Thursday morning, 18 days after my termination. The submission ran to 47 pages of narrative and documentation, organized chronologically, with exhibits cross-referenced and labeled. I had formatted it according to the agency's published guidance for complex, multi-quarter financial fraud submissions, and Elena had added the legal analysis framework. We submitted it with a cover letter that specifically requested confidential treatment and noted the time-sensitive nature of the matter given the personnel changes at Aldercroft. Then I waited. Waiting is its own skill. I had learned it. Over a career in finance, where the space between identifying a problem and being able to act on it can be weeks or months, and where the temptation to move before you're ready can destroy everything you've built. I was good at waiting. I filled it usefully. I had not been idle in the weeks since leaving Aldercroft. I had, in fact, been working harder than I had in years, which was saying something. But the work was different now. It was entirely my own. I had maintained, throughout my tenure at Aldercroft, a small consulting practice incorporated under my name. I had not used it much during my CFO years. The employment agreement had restrictions on outside consulting that I had respected, but the corporate entity existed, had a tax history, had a bank account. My employment agreement had also contained, in Section 7, a provision that I had negotiated in my original contract and renewed at each extension, that any intellectual work product I produced independently, on my own time, and without use of company resources, remained my personal property. I had been careful always about that line. The day after I was terminated, I called 2 former colleagues who had left Aldercroft over the past 3 years, and whom I knew were currently consulting independently. I called a partner at a law firm I had worked with on a deal 4 years prior. I called the CFO of a mid-sized manufacturing company whose board had once asked if I'd be interested in a position, and I had declined. By the end of my second week of unemployment, I had 3 consulting engagements. None of them were large. One was a fractional CFO arrangement with a growth-stage technology company that needed help preparing for a Series B. One was a project-based review of financial controls for a family office that had grown fast enough to outpace its governance. The third was a board advisory role with a nonprofit that needed help restructuring its endowment strategy. Modest. Calibrated. Enough to keep my mind occupied and my practice active while I waited. I also called my financial advisor and told her I was restructuring my personal portfolio. I moved a portion of my liquid investments into instruments that were not correlated with the financial services sector. This was not paranoia. It was the logical consequence of knowing what I knew. If Aldercroft's manipulation eventually became public, the sector would experience turbulence. I had no interest in being financially exposed to that turbulence. My severance covered my immediate expenses, with significant room to spare. The 3 consulting engagements added a layer of operational income. I was not comfortable in the way that I had been comfortable when a large salary arrived reliably every 2 weeks, but I was not desperate, and desperation was the condition that would have compromised everything. I want to be clear about something that I think gets misunderstood in stories like this. I was not motivated by revenge. Revenge is a feeling. Feelings make people sloppy. They make people move too fast, say too much, reach for the satisfying gesture instead of the effective one. The satisfying gesture in my situation would have been confronting Dorian in the lobby of Aldercroft Capital on my last day and telling him exactly what I knew and what I was going to do about it. That would have felt good, for approximately 4 seconds, and would have given him time to cover tracks, brief lawyers, and potentially interfere with my documentation. I was motivated by something closer to obligation. Aldercroft managed assets on behalf of real investors, pension funds, university endowments, foundations that used their returns to fund programs for actual human beings. The misrepresentation I had found was not a victimless technical violation. It was a scheme that, if it continued and eventually collapsed, could cause material harm to those investors. Their exposure was real. I had the information and the expertise to do something about it. That was enough. The SEC's preliminary contact came on a Wednesday afternoon, 5 weeks after our submission. Elena received a call from an attorney in the Division of Enforcement who wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the materials we had submitted. The phrasing of the request was encouraging. It wasn't a pro forma acknowledgement. It was a substantive inquiry with specific questions about certain exhibits. We met with 2 enforcement attorneys and a forensic accountant at Elena's office the following Tuesday. The forensic accountant had the slightly abstracted expression of someone who spent most of her professional life looking at columns of numbers for things that didn't add up. I recognized the expression. I had seen it in my own reflection. I walked them through the documentation for 3 hours. The forensic accountant, her name was Patricia, and she had about 15 years on me in terms of the comfortable precision with which she moved through financial statements, kept returning to the footnote analysis. She would flip back to the same exhibit, make a note, look at the corresponding contract language, make another note. At the end of the 3 hours, the lead enforcement attorney, a man named Conrad, who had the economical manner of someone who never used 2 words where one would serve, looked at me and said, "You've been constructing this for 7 months?" From the first anomaly I found, yes. While employed there? The documentation was created outside of company time and on personal devices, as confirmed by the metadata I've included in the exhibit appendix. He glanced at Patricia. She nodded without looking up from the footnote analysis. "We're going to need some additional materials from you," Conrad said. "Specifically, the original source documents for Exhibits 11 through 19. "I have them." He looked at me for a moment, with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration. Something in between. "We'll be in touch," he said. They were in touch the following Monday with a formal document request. Elena and I spent 4 days organizing the responsive materials. 2 weeks after my termination, Delphine Voss had officially taken the title of Chief Financial Officer of Aldercroft Capital. I thought about her sometimes, in those weeks. I thought about what she was seeing when she sat down at that desk, whether she was reading the same footnotes I had read, whether she understood what she was looking at. 11 days after she started, the SEC issued a formal order of investigation. I learned this not from Conrad or from Elena, but from a filing that appeared in the SEC's Edgar database, because formal orders of investigation are public documents. The name of Aldercroft Capital was there, plain as anything. The order referenced potential violations of Sections 10B, 13A, and 13B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Section 10B covered securities fraud. Section 13A covered filing false or misleading periodic reports. Section 13B covered internal accounting controls. They were taking it seriously. I found out later from Conrad in a brief call that Elena listened to on speakerphone that within 48 hours of the order of investigation, the SEC's forensic team had identified in Aldercroft's own records evidence of the same discrepancies I had documented, plus 3 additional quarters I hadn't had access to because they post-dated my departure. The additional quarters were the ones that undid Delphine. Here is what the SEC found, and what was later reported in the enforcement proceedings. Within her first 2 weeks as CFO, Delphine Voss had signed off on a set of internal accounting memos that reclassified certain credit instrument holdings in a way that deferred loss recognition by approximately $8 million. The memos were dated within her first 8 business days on the job. She either knew exactly what she was doing, or she had been handed a set of instructions and followed them without examining what they meant closely enough. In securities enforcement, that distinction matters less than you might expect. Scienter, the legal standard for fraud, can be satisfied by recklessness, not just intent. And signing off on a material misrepresentation of your firm's financial position within 2 weeks of starting the job, when you are the CFO and that is literally the core of your professional responsibility, is difficult to characterize as innocent error. The SEC examination team arrived at Aldercroft's offices on a Thursday morning. I heard about it from 2 separate sources: a former colleague who texted me something carefully neutral, and a financial news aggregator that picked up the story within 4 hours based on a tip from someone inside the building. The news reports were careful, as they always are before proceedings are formal, but the outline was there. A regulatory examination at Aldercroft. Questions about the accuracy of recent financial disclosures. The stock price of two public entities that had cross-holdings with Aldercroft dropped measurably that afternoon. I was in a video call with the board of the nonprofit I was advising when I got the alert on my phone. I finished the call. Then I sat for a while in my home office, which was quiet in the way home offices are when you've lived alone long enough to stop noticing the absence of other sounds. I wasn't thinking about Dorian. I was thinking about the pension fund managers who would need to recalibrate their exposure, about what the disclosure of the full scope of the manipulation would mean for the investors who had trusted Aldercroft with their capital, about whether the $8 million in deferred losses from Delphine's first 2 weeks was the only new exposure, or whether there was more. There was more, Conrad told Elena 3 weeks later, when the scope of the investigation had expanded, and the enforcement team had subpoenaed records from both Aldercroft and Meridian Capital Partners. The total adjusted exposure across 8 quarters was $47 million. My original conservative estimate of 20 to 40 had been, as I had expected, on the lower end. The investigation became public in a formal sense 6 weeks after the examination team's visit. The SEC issued a litigation release announcing charges against Aldercroft Capital Management, its CEO Dorian, and its CFO Delphine Voss, along with 2 executives from Meridian Capital Partners. Dorian's charges included fraud, books and records violations, and failure to supervise. The charges acknowledged that the scheme had been in operation for 2 years prior to Delphine's arrival. He was the origin point. Delphine's charges were narrower but not trivial. 2 counts of securities fraud related to the memos she had signed in her first 2 weeks. The enforcement team had determined, based on communications recovered in the examination, that she had been specifically briefed on the existing structure before accepting the role and had agreed to continue it as a condition of her hire. She had known. She had agreed. She had signed the memos. I read the litigation release sitting at my kitchen table, with the same cup of coffee going cold beside me that I always let go cold because I make it and then get distracted by whatever I'm reading. The release ran to 9 pages. It described the scheme in precise regulatory language that was accurate in its facts and completely bloodless in its affect. Reading it, you would know what had happened. You would not feel it. I felt it differently. I felt it in the 7 months of Saturday mornings I had spent cross-referencing footnotes instead of doing other things. I felt it in the 11 days between my termination and the press release about Delphine that I had spent not knowing whether I had identified something real or whether I was so angry at being pushed out that I was constructing a pattern from coincidence. I had known, by the end of those 11 days, that it was real. But knowing and proving are different experiences, and the distance between them is where the work lives. The SEC's whistleblower program is not designed to provide instant vindication. It's designed to protect and incentivize individuals who have original information about securities violations and are willing to bear the considerable cost of coming forward. The process is long. The confidentiality protections are real, but require active maintenance. You cannot, if you are a whistleblower, simply watch from a distance and feel satisfied. You have to participate, answer document requests, submit to interviews, organize and reorganize materials in whatever format the enforcement team needs, at whatever stage of the investigation they're at. I did all of it. I want to talk about something that I think people misunderstand about that process, because it's the part that no one talks about when they tell stories like this. The cost of doing the right thing, when the right thing is hard, is rarely the external cost. It's rarely the severance negotiation or the document preparation or even the legal fees, which in my case were structured as a contingency arrangement because Elena believed in the strength of the submission. The cost is the sustained uncertainty, the weeks where you know what you know, but you have no confirmation that anyone with authority to act on it will act on it in time to prevent further harm. There were nights during those weeks when I sat in my kitchen and ran the numbers again in my head and wondered whether the forensic accountant at the SEC had found what I'd pointed her toward, or whether the investigation had gotten bogged down in procedural requirements and the clock was running on Aldercroft investors who didn't know what was coming. I had one conversation during that period that I returned to sometimes. About 4 weeks after the investigation became public, I was at a coffee meeting with the CFO of a manufacturing company, who was exploring whether I'd be interested in taking on a longer-term advisory engagement. Her name was Josephine, and she was 20 years into her career, and had the particular authority of someone who had survived enough corporate upheavals to find them, if not amusing, then at least navigable. We talked about the consulting work I'd been doing. We talked about her company's growth. Then, toward the end of the meeting, she said, "I saw the news about Aldercroft." I said yes. She said, "Were you there when it happened?" I said I had been CFO until March. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wondered." That was all she said about it. We went back to talking about her balance sheet, and the meeting ended warmly, and she sent a follow-up email the next day initiating the engagement. She never asked me directly if I was the whistleblower. I never told her. The SEC's confidentiality protections are real, but they only extend as far as the SEC itself and the people involved in the enforcement process. Your identity in the wider world is your own to manage. I had not told anyone, except Elena, what I had done. My former colleagues who reached out with carefully neutral texts about the examination did not know whether I was involved or simply gone before it started. I had decided, early, that the only correct answer to any question about my potential involvement was no answer at all. Not a denial, not a confirmation. A redirect. "It must have been a difficult place to work, given what was happening," Josephine said, before we moved on. "Every place has its dynamics," I said. That was true enough. The enforcement proceedings moved with what Conrad told Elena was unusual speed, given the complexity of the case. The fact that the whistleblower submission had been so thoroughly documented reduced the amount of investigative work required to establish the pattern. They had, essentially, a map they could spend their examination time testing and confirming rather than discovering. Aldercroft Capital's board, which had approved my termination and Delphine's hire, moved quickly once the charges were filed. 3 board members resigned in the first week. The remaining board hired a restructuring firm and appointed an independent monitor. Dorian was put on administrative leave, a purely cosmetic gesture, given that the charges against him personally included fraud, but boards do cosmetic things while the lawyers work. Delphine resigned within 48 hours of the charges being announced. I read that news the same way I had read all the other news about this. Carefully, without drama, at my kitchen table. She was 34 years old. She had an impressive resume. She had, at some point before accepting the Aldercroft role, made a decision that she had probably rationalized in the way people rationalize things that benefit them personally, while causing harm to others. She had been told, I assumed, that the adjustment to the disclosures was a technical matter, a timing question, a difference of interpretation. She had been told, I assumed, that it was temporary. It was never temporary. It was a structure that required ongoing maintenance, and the maintenance required a CFO who was willing to sign off on memos she shouldn't sign. The consequences for her were real and significant. I was not glad about them. I was not sorry about them. They were the logical outcome of the choice she had made. The SEC does not grade on a curve for people who made bad choices in favorable circumstances. The award notification from the SEC arrived through Elena's office, in a communication that was, by design, dry and procedural. The agency had determined that my submission constituted original information that had led to the successful enforcement action. The total sanctions in the case, including disgorgement and civil penalties, were assessed at $61 million. The whistleblower award, at the percentage rate determined by the agency based on the quality and comprehensiveness of the submission, was approximately 14% of that total. The number, when Elena read it to me over the phone, was the kind of number that requires a moment of stillness before it becomes real. It became real in about 4 seconds. I was, by the time she finished the sentence, already thinking about the tax implications and the correct reporting treatment because that is the kind of person I am, and nothing about an unexpected large number changes that. "Congratulations," Elena said. She sounded genuinely pleased, which she was entitled to be, because her percentage of the award was not negligible, and she had done excellent work. "Thank you," I said. "For all of it." "You brought me the complete package," she said. "I just filed the paperwork." That was both true and underselling herself, but I let it stand. I will not pretend that the money was unimportant. I will not perform the kind of modesty that involves saying what you truly valued was justice, and the rest was beside the point. The money was a significant and direct consequence of documented, rigorous, sustained work, and I valued it accordingly. But the money was also instrumental. It was what allowed the next phase of what I was already planning. I had spent 8 months in a state of suspended certainty. I knew what I knew, and I was acting on it, but the outcome was not yet visible. That kind of certainty in uncertainty is exhausting in a specific way. Not the kind of exhausted that rest cures, but the kind that only resolves when the thing you've been holding eventually either arrives or doesn't. The enforcement action arrived, and then the exhaustion lifted, and I noticed for the first time what had replaced it. Space. My calendar had time in it that I had not allocated. Not empty time. The consulting work was ongoing, and I had in the months of the investigation been building something more substantive with 2 of the 3 initial engagements. The growth stage technology company had asked me to come on as interim CFO through their Series B raise, and I had agreed. It was different from Aldercroft. Smaller, earlier stage. The problems were different, more elementary in some ways and more creative in others. I found that I was enjoying it. The family office engagement had expanded into a more formal advisory relationship. The foundation's CFO had referred me to 2 other foundations in her network, and I had taken one of those on as well. None of it looked like what my career had looked like 3 years ago, 6 years ago. It didn't look like something that could be described on a press release in a way that sounded impressive to people who measure careers by title and firm name. I didn't miss the press release version. I want to describe something that happened about 4 months after the enforcement action became public, because it is the kind of thing that doesn't get included in these stories, but is, in my experience, the most honest part of them. I was at a financial services industry conference. Not a large one, a regional gathering of CFOs and treasury professionals, the kind of event I had attended every year for a decade without thinking much about it. I had registered independently, as a consultant, rather than as a representative of a firm. At a cocktail reception on the first evening, a man I recognized from years of industry overlap appeared at my elbow. His name was Aldous, and he had been a CFO at one of Aldercroft's indirect competitors and had always been, in the careful language of people who are professional rivals, professionally cordial. "Vesper," he said, "I heard you'd gone independent." "About 8 months ago," I said. He nodded. He had the particular expression of someone deciding how directly to say something. "Quite a situation over at Aldercroft." "Yes." He looked at me. He knew. I could tell he knew. Or suspected strongly, the way people in a small industry eventually piece together the outline of things. He wasn't going to say it directly. Neither was I. "Good people get pushed out of firms for the wrong reasons," he said. "It's a consistent pattern." "It is," I agreed. "And sometimes," he said, picking up his drink, "the firms in question discover that was not actually to their advantage." He moved on to speak to someone else. I stood there for a moment holding my own drink, which was cold in my hand the way drinks always are at those events, and thought about the particular satisfaction of a sentence like that. Oblique, accurate, delivered without drama. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I received from the industry, and it was enough. The Aldercroft situation concluded in a way that was painful for its investors and clarifying for the broader market. The firm entered a consent decree with the SEC. 2 of the Meridian executives settled civil charges with disgorgement and penalties. Dorian's case took longer to resolve because he contested elements of the fraud charges. It ultimately settled on terms that included a significant financial penalty, a bar from serving as an officer or director of any SEC-registered entity, and what is technically called an undertaking, which in practical terms meant he had agreed to a set of ongoing disclosure and compliance obligations. He did not go to prison. That is the outcome in most securities fraud cases that don't involve outright theft of client funds. The enforcement system is calibrated for financial consequences and professional prohibitions rather than incarceration, particularly for first-time corporate offenders who settle cooperatively. I am at peace with that, which I know sounds like a thing people say when they're not at peace with it. Let me try to be more precise. I believe the enforcement consequences were proportionate to the harm established in the proceedings. I believe the professional prohibitions will, in practice, significantly limit his ability to cause similar harm in the future. I believe the financial penalties, combined with the reputational consequences, constitute a meaningful outcome. I also believe that no enforcement action fully accounts for the aggregate harm caused to every investor who held assets managed by Aldercroft during the period the manipulation was ongoing. Those two things can both be true. The system has limits. Working within those limits to get the most complete outcome available is still worth doing. About 6 months after the award was final, I had a meeting with Elena. Not about legal matters. We had concluded the formal aspects of the representation. It was more of a check-in, over lunch at a restaurant she liked near her office. The kind of restaurant with good food and no discernible aesthetic, which I always find is a reliable indicator of a place that doesn't need to perform. She asked how the consulting work was going. I told her about the Series B, which had closed successfully. I told her about the foundation work. I told her I was considering something more formal, a registered investment advisory firm. Small, focused on a specific kind of client, which I had been thinking about for a while and was now positioned to pursue. "That sounds right for you," she said. "It does," I agreed. She asked whether I had heard from anyone at Aldercroft since the proceedings concluded. I had. 2 weeks before our lunch, I had received an email from an Aldercroft board member who had joined after the restructuring began. It was a carefully worded message. It acknowledged that the firm was in a different position now. It said that the board recognized the value of the compliance and audit infrastructure that had been in place prior to the period in question. It asked whether I would be willing to have a conversation about a potential advisory role in the restructuring process. I read the email twice, then I archived it without responding. Elena, when I told her this, raised an eyebrow. "No response at all?" "No response at all," I said. She thought about this. "Not even to decline?" "The silence is the decline," I said. "They know what it means. Anyone who reads a financial statement knows that silence is a position." She smiled at that. It was the kind of smile that contains several things at once. We finished lunch. She told me about a case she was working on that she couldn't describe specifically, but that involved a pattern she had seen before. I gave her some thoughts on the documentation strategy. We split the bill, which we always did, and went our separate ways. I want to say something about Delphine, because I have thought about her more than I expected to. She lost her job. She lost her professional reputation in a field where reputation is the operating currency. She was 34 years old. She had presumably spent her 20s and early 30s building toward the kind of position she had accepted at Aldercroft. And then, in her first 2 weeks, she had signed memos that she should not have signed, and the entire architecture collapsed. I do not know what she was told before she accepted the role. I do not know how the situation was presented to her by whoever brought her in. I know that the communications recovered in the investigation suggested she had been briefed on the scheme and had agreed to it. I know she signed the memos. I know the enforcement team found nothing to suggest coercion. She made a choice. It was a bad choice. The consequences were proportionate. But I have thought occasionally about the moment of that choice. The moment where someone makes a calculation, maybe quickly, maybe over days, about whether the thing being offered to them is worth what it requires. Whether the professional assent, the title, the salary, the external validation of the role is worth what they're being asked to carry. She concluded it was. I had made the opposite calculation at several points in my career, including the 6 months before I found the first footnote, when I had been offered a position at a different firm that I had declined because something about the financial structure of their flagship product didn't add up in ways I couldn't fully articulate, but also couldn't dismiss. I stayed at Aldercroft instead, for reasons that seemed like the right reasons at the time. There's no lesson in that comparison, no moral geometry that makes one choice noble and the other corrupt. She knew more than I had known in the similar moment, and she chose differently. That's the whole story. What I have taken from it is something simpler, that the professional expertise I spent years developing is not just a tool for doing a job. It is also a tool for seeing things clearly, for reading footnotes carefully, for knowing what a date discrepancy in an amortization schedule means, for understanding that the gap between what a financial document says and what the underlying contracts say is not a formatting issue. That expertise was valuable to Aldercroft in the way they used it, which was to make their disclosures accurate and defensible. It became valuable to me in a different way, when they decided they needed someone who would use it differently. The thing about financial knowledge, real financial knowledge, is that it doesn't transfer loyalty. It belongs to whoever has it. My registered investment advisory firm opened its doors, formally about 14 months after the morning of the burnt coffee and the salmon smell and the 11 seconds at the elevator. I named it something plain and accurate. Voss Meridian Capital had Wyndham with their understated names and their connections. I didn't need a name with history or resonance. I needed a name that was mine and that said what it was. I called it Sarin Advisory Group. The name was on the door of a suite, offices on the 17th floor of a building that smelled, I noticed on the first morning, like fresh paint and cleaning solution. Clean and specific and new. My first 3 clients came from the network I had built during the months of consulting work. The Series B company's founders, now post-close, wanted ongoing CFO advisory services as they grew. One of the foundations I had worked with brought me on formally as a strategic financial consultant. The third was a referral from Josephine, the manufacturing company's CFO, whose sister-in-law ran a family foundation that had been looking for exactly the kind of specialized expertise I offered. None of it was large. All of it was exactly the right size for where I was. I had 2 part-time staff, a financial analyst 2 years out of business school who was careful and quick, and an operations manager who had been an executive assistant for 15 years and ran the administrative side of things with a competence so thorough, it was almost invisible. The first week, I came in at 7 in the morning, made coffee in the small kitchen off the main office, the right temperature and strength the way I had always preferred it, sat at my desk and reviewed the documents on my schedule for the day. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but productive. The kind that exists when every person in the room is doing exactly the work they should be doing for exactly the reasons they should be doing it. I had built this, not from luck, not because someone had decided I deserved it, or because the situation had resolved in a way that made everything suddenly fair. I had built it from 7 months of early mornings cross-referencing footnotes, from a submission that ran 47 pages, from 3 consulting engagements that started modest and expanded through demonstrated competence, from every professional skill I had developed over a career that was not finished because one man with folded hands had decided it should be. Dorian had looked across his desk at me and seen a line item to be cut. That was a miscalculation so fundamental that it would take him years to fully understand what he'd done. He had handed me the freedom to stop building someone else's architecture. That sounds like the kind of observation that ends a story with a feeling of completion, a door closing, a final image of someone at peace with where she's landed. But that's not quite what I mean by it. The work at Sarin was real work. It had hard days. It had days when a client made a decision I thought was wrong, and I had to decide how strenuously to object, and when to accept that my role was advisory, not authoritative. It had days when the revenue projections were tight, and the expenses were real, and I had to make the same kinds of calibrating decisions I used to make for Aldercroft. But now, the entity whose survival was at stake was mine. Those days were instructive in ways the comfortable days were not. About 2 years. After my termination, I accepted a speaking invitation from a professional association of financial executives. The invitation was framed around my expertise in compliance and disclosure practices, which had become the subject of some industry attention in the wake of the Aldercroft case, even though my name had never been publicly connected to the investigation. The audience was several hundred CFOs and senior financial officers, and I spoke for 40 minutes about documentation practices and internal control frameworks, and the specific role that footnote disclosure plays in financial statement accuracy. I said one thing near the end that I had not planned to say. It arrived in the speaking, the way things sometimes do when you've been thinking about something long enough that it becomes available without effort. I said, the most useful thing I ever did in my career was maintain documentation of my own work. Not for any anticipated purpose, not because I expected to need it, because when you build something carefully, the record of how you built it is itself a form of value. You can defend it, you can share it, you can submit it to a federal regulatory agency in a 47-page exhibit, whatever you need. There was a laugh in the room at the last part. I had not said it as a joke, exactly, but the laughter was the right response, which is sometimes how you know you've said a thing accurately. Afterward, in the lobby, a woman in her early 40s introduced herself. She had that particular quality of someone who has been holding a question throughout a presentation and has been patient about it. "I'm the CFO of a firm that's going through some internal changes," she said. "I've found some things in our disclosures that I'm not comfortable with. I've reported internally, and the response has been, let's say, insufficient." She was talking to me carefully, the way people do when they're not sure how much to say in a lobby. I gave her Elena's name and contact information. "She's excellent," I said. "She'll tell you your options. Whatever you decide after that is your decision to make." The woman put the card in her bag. She looked relieved in a complicated way, the way people look when they've said something they've needed to say and the world did not immediately end. I had looked like that once, sitting across from Elena for the first time, trying to explain what I had found in a footnote about an amortization schedule and why it mattered. I thought about that on the drive back from the conference. The way a thing begins with a single number that doesn't quite match, and the choice you make in that moment, to dismiss it, to note it and move on, to sit with the discomfort until you understand what you're looking at, determines everything that follows. The number had been correct. The dates had been wrong. I had looked at the wrong dates long enough to understand what they were hiding. Everything else had followed from there. Serin, advisory group, is still operating. We've grown in the way that small advisory firms grow when they do the work correctly. Not spectacularly, not in ways that generate press releases, but steadily, by word of mouth, by results that speak accurately for themselves. I don't miss Aldercroft. I miss, occasionally, the particular rhythm of a large organization at scale, the way large problems have large solutions and the stakes are visible. But I don't miss it the way you miss something that was good for you. I miss it the way you miss a thing that was familiar. The last time I heard Dorian's name professionally was in a compliance newsletter that reported on the monitoring obligations he had agreed to in the settlement. I read the item with the same attention I give any industry news and moved on. The last item I had on my desk from the Aldercroft chapter of my career was a photocopy of the letter signed by Dorian and a board member on the day I was terminated, confirming that my departure was without cause. Section 12. Severance, continued benefits, outstanding equity grants. I had kept the letter not as a trophy. I had kept it because it was a document, and documents are always worth keeping, and you never know in advance which one will be the one you reach for when you need it. I filed it in a folder labeled with the year and put it on a shelf in my office, where it sat between two other folders that were also labeled with years, in the company of everything else I had written down and preserved and cross-referenced and organized over the course of a career.
And they were right. Arcane made therapists around the world rich. I know. Oh my god, there's so many good characters in that. Oh, hi little person. It was a perfect combination. Yes, of everything, every bit of it. This is what we were talking, like the animation style and the way that they combined that with the music and just like, I mean, it was, every part of it was so wonderfully done. Literally all I've thought about every day for well over a year. Oh, it's so good. Hi, Henry. How do? Ooh, Severance. I loved Severance, Asmodeus. Yeah. Children of Ruin. Sci-fi book that Carson's Discord got me into. Okay. I don't mind AIS, Australian Intelligence Streamer. Heck yeah. Why, hello, Maida. How do you do? And yeah. Victor is rotating in the back of my mind at any given moment. I love this. No spoilers. Haven't seen season 2. Okay, no spoilers. None at all. It's just so fucking good. It's so good. Yeah, I love it. I love it. What was the other thing? Oh, I have Lego is the other thing that I was thinking about. Or a game. That might be crazy. Sean spoiled, just gush. Yeah. Opinion voted most attractive streamer on Twitch. I highly doubt that. But thank you. Was there just one vote? Was there just one vote cast? Yeah, it's so, Arcane was so good. It was so good. Yeah, you've seen the music